Welcome back, everyone, to the Monitoring to Action stream. Our presentation here is PFAS in Wisconsin waters. Our presenters today are Meghan Williams and Mike Shupryt. Meghan is a water quality toxicologist at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Her work involves assessing the risk of exposure to harmful substances and developing surface water criteria for the protection of human health and aquatic life. And Mike is the Streams and Rivers Monitoring Coordinator in the Bureau of Water Quality for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. His work involves developing strategy, protocols, and monitoring designs for a variety of chemical and physical and biological measures in stream ecosystems, mostly related to the Clean Water Act programs. And with that, I will turn it over to Meghan and Mike. If you've got questions or comments, feel free to use the chat box on your screen.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Meghan Williams. And as Chris was just saying, I'm a water quality toxicologist at DNR. And today, myself and Mike are going to talk to you about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as PFAS, in Wisconsin waters. So we have our presentation divided up into 4 main sections, which I am trying to get to right now. There we go. The first one is just an introduction. What are PFAS? Where did they come from? Why should you care about them? And then Mike is going to take over talking about how we are monitoring for PFAS in Wisconsin waters, including the protocols that we use to monitor for these substances, as well as results from our 2019 monitoring efforts. And then I'm going to talk about what we're going to do in part with some of that monitoring data, which is create surface water quality standards for 2 types of PFAS called PFOS, perfluorooctane sulfonate, and PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid. And then we'll have time for discussion and questions. So we'll start out with an introduction. And at their base, PFAS generally are a fluorinated carbon chain, which is called the tail, attached to a head, which is made up of a functional group. So if you think of a caterpillar, the fluorinated carbon chain would be the tail of the caterpillar, and then the functional group would be the head of the caterpillar. And we talk about perfluorinated compounds frequently, which means every single one of those carbons in that tail is attached to fluorines. And then we also have polyfluorinated compounds where at least one carbon in that tail is not attached to a fluorine. So keep these in mind for the future. Later in the presentation, we'll discuss more why it matters whether or not every single carbon is attached to a fluorine. So PFOS and PFOA, the 2 types of PFAS that we are talking about today, are not the only types of perfluoroalkyl compounds there are. We have well over 4,000 compounds. And I should mention these are all human-made. These do not occur naturally in the environment. So they can broadly be broken up into polymers and non-polymers, and then polyfluorinated and perfluorinated, as we were just discussing. Those can each be broken up into their own groups, and then we get all the way over to the right-hand side of the screen where we have carboxylic acids, which is where PFOA belongs, and then sulfonic acids, which is where PFOS belongs. And each one of these orange boxes could be further divided the way that perfluoroalkyl acids is divided. So just to give you a scope of the different types of compounds we're dealing with, even though we're focusing mainly on PFOA and PFOS, there are a lot of them. So the structure of PFAS, this tail and this head, imparts useful properties. The head of the structure is hydrophobic and lipophobic, which means it repels both water and fats. And the head is polar and hydrophilic. I can't remember if I just said the tail is hydrophobic, but you guys can read it on the screen in case I said it incorrectly. The head is hydrophilic, which means that it likes water. And so because of this structure, PFAS are often used for their water and oil repelling properties, and they also form films at the interface between air and liquids. And for this reason, they have been used since they started being developed in the 1930s and 1940s. They have been used for a variety of product coverings. So they started out being used as nonstick coatings for pots and pans. So we think of like Teflon. They are also used in protective coatings on outdoor equipment, so things like Gore-Tex, as well as fabric sprays like Scotchgard. They're also used in food packaging, so anything where there's grease on the inside of a package and they don't want the grease to reach to the outside of the package. Pizza boxes, microwave popcorn, fast food wrappers, that type of thing. They're used in personal care products. And then one of the reasons that they're widely distributed throughout Wisconsin and other locations is that they're used in these aqueous film forming foams, or AFFF, which is a firefighting foam that is used predominantly at military installations and airports. This is a really effective way to starve a fire of oxygen, and so they use it when they want to really quickly put out a fire that has really terrible implications, such as at an airport. So going back to why PFAS are a problem, the crux of the issue is that this carbon-fluorine bond that makes up the tail is really, really strong. The fluorine atoms act as a shield around the carbon atoms in the middle and protect them from chemical reactions. So this means that that tail does not undergo any degradation, and it really only thermally degrades at really high temperatures. So in order to get rid of PFAS, you have to heat them up or heat up the substance that they're in to really, really high temperatures. And as a result of that, PFAS are very persistent in the environment. And they also, some of them are really highly bioaccumulative, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. But when we think back to those perfluorinated and polyfluorinated compounds, some of the newer substances that have been developed in recent years have been developed as polyfluorinated compounds, which means there's a break in that carbon-fluorine chain where there's not fluorines around some carbons. And what that break in the fluorines does is give other chemical reactions the opportunity to access that carbon chain and break it up. So some of these newer PFAS can be broken down. So for example, if there are two 4 carbon chains that are connected in the middle with one carbon that is sort of exposed, it can be broken up into 2 4 carbon chains, but then it cannot be broken up any further. So this persistence and the bioaccumulation potential that some of them have cause PFAS to be globally distributed. And what this means is that they have been found pretty much in wildlife on every continent. They have been found in surface waters across the globe. And then they've also been found in blood or serum samples from humans almost ubiquitously across the world. And this is an issue because they have documented toxicity. So in animal studies, they have shown negative health effects predominantly on the animal's livers, their immune system, and then their ability to reproduce and the ability of babies to develop normally. They have also found issues with the endocrine system, specifically the thyroid, and an increased incidence of some types of cancers. In humans, we have also found probable links to human health effects, specifically negative effects on childhood growth and development, an increased risk of having high blood pressure during pregnancy, some issues again with the thyroid, so hormone regulation, increased cholesterol levels, some negative effects on the immune system, which often manifest themselves in things like ulcerative colitis, as well as for exposure to PFOA, not PFAS, just PFOA, an increased risk of kidney and testicular cancer. So, sort of in summary here, we have PFAS, which are a family of thousands of compounds that don't normally occur in nature. Their unique chemical structure gives them a lot of really useful properties for humans, so oil and water repelling properties. But this chemical structure also means that they don't really degrade, and some of them are highly bioaccumulative. So you can have a small amount in the water, but it turns into a lot in the fish. Because they are resistant to degradation, they've been found almost everywhere across the globe, and they have some adverse health effects in animals and humans. However, not to continue to be a downer here, DNR is doing things to try to assess the extent of contamination in the environment and restrict future contamination. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike now. Just Mike, let me know when you want me to change the slides. He's going to talk about our monitoring efforts for PFAS.
All right, thank you, Megan. Again, I'm Mike Shupryt with Wisconsin DNR, and I work with our monitoring program. So specifically, I'll be talking about what we've been doing in terms of monitoring for PFAS. I can go to the next slide. So just to set the stage a little bit, I'm assuming a number of folks in the audience here are volunteer citizen lake monitors or stream monitoring or professional folks who are familiar with monitoring. And I'd like to just talk about PFAS and really show how we're concerned at these like really low levels. And that actually causes, some complications for monitoring. So for instance, if you were to go out and sample for dissolved oxygen, if you're a citizen volunteer, you may use like a hot kit or use a meter. In streams, we might be concerned around 7 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen for cold water streams, something like that. So that's milligrams per liter, that's like weight per volume of water. If we were to look at that at nanograms per liter, a much smaller measurement, that's 7 million nanograms per liter. If we look at total phosphorus, which has probably been talked about a bit at the conference over the past 2 days, or maybe even you've sampled for it in lakes and rivers, we might be concerned in the range of micrograms per liter. Micrograms per liter is that funny looking U, just a smaller unit of measurement. We start to be concerned around 75 micrograms per liter for wadeable streams. Again, that's 75,000 nanograms per liter. If we look at PFOS, PFOS, right, one particular member of all the PFAS, we're worried about it in the nanogram per liter range. If we look at Michigan and their surface water standard, it's 12 nanograms per liter. So that'd be, if you had a liter of water, you might have 7 million nanograms of dissolved oxygen in that water, and only 12 nanograms of PFAS, and yet we'd be concerned about how much PFAS was in that liter of water. So just to give you some reference there. Next, please. So we started a major monitoring program in 2019, but that wasn't really the first time that we started looking at PFAS. From 2006 to 2012, we are sampling fish along the Great Lakes and other large rivers with industrial use for PFAS and fish tissues. We were doing this in a project in cooperation with other Great Lakes states as well as US EPA. And what we found was PFOS was found in over 99% of the samples that we took. In this case, samples is fancy science language for fish. So yes, we did find this, almost everywhere. PFAS specifically, we found some differences than your normal maybe fish contaminants that some of you are used to, where the highest PFAS concentration were in, say, quote unquote, panfish, things such as bluegill, crappie, and white bass. Typically, when we look at fish contaminants, usually the highest concentrations are in top predators, like musky walleye, or bottom-dwelling fish that maybe have a lot of fatty tissue. However, PFAS seem to behave a little differently, and that for some reason we find higher PFAS in these panfish, and specifically in their muscle, in their fish tissue. Next slide. And so on top of that, we started another monitoring project in 2019. I have to give a huge kudos here to the Wisconsin State Lab of Hygiene that has been processing all these samples. They've been working on fish tissue samples for years and updating their methods. They developed a surface water method and a drinking water method for analysis. And again, we're concerned about PFAS at such low values that this really is a difficult test to run. And they got it up and running for us and been able to handle the samples we're sending them. Ourselves, we didn't have a really rigorous monitoring program for PFAS, so we had to develop an SOP. We adapted pretty heavily from Michigan DEQ. Michigan has really been at the forefront of PFAS monitoring because really they have a few of these really high priority sites that actually got the nation interested in what's happening with PFAS. And so now we have approved SOP that specifically talks about the materials that can be used or actually warned while sampling for PFAS. These things really are in a lot of everyday products, which really makes the sampling and the possible for cross-contamination pretty difficult. But we get pretty specific down to the waders you can use, what types of pens, the sunscreen, plus the SPF that you can use to be sure that everything is PFAS free. We get pretty detailed with it. But I think the one complaint we hear from a lot of our field staff is that they can't go get their Egg McMuffins in the morning before sampling. Again, those fast food wrappers probably contain PFAS. So we're very careful to keep a clean site. There's a number of alternatives you can use for monitoring activities or just everyday materials if you're interested for these water repellent or properties that you may be looking for. Such things as silicone is PFAS free. You may have this just in your kitchen for some baking that you might do. They also make a silicone spray that you could spray on your jacket, your shoes to beef up the waterproofing that doesn't have PFAS. Anything stainless steel wouldn't contain PFAS. Some plastics are okay to use, specifically high density polyethylene. The plastics all have really long sort of fancy names to them, but HDPE is safe to use and PFAS free. And then some of the old standbys, such as like PVC or neoprene materials, are all waterproofing materials that would be PFAS free and are sort of safe to use in this type of situation. So we went out to explore a number of sites that were suspected of having some sort of PFAS contamination in 2019. And this actually, the site list came to us in multiple different ways of what could potentially be reaching the water surface. We talked about AFFF firefighting foam that's used specifically these training grounds, these light it and fight it types of training, where at the same location over and over they practice using these chemicals. because they are really good at putting out fires, and there certainly are cases where you'd want to use the best stuff that you have on hand. But again, in these practice areas, these training grounds, there's concerns of the foam, the PFAS specifically, reaching surface water. We looked at a couple of municipal and industrial waste outfalls, specifically municipal wastewater treatment plants. Your local wastewater treatment plant doesn't produce or use PFAS in any of its daily operations. However, these upstream users may be using PFAS in their products or manufacturing processes, and it's really just a pinch point where all the PFAS would flow through and into the surface water. There are a couple of one particularly interesting case along the Central Wisconsin River in central Wisconsin, where there's a BioSentinel wildlife monitoring program for contaminants. And this program noticed elevated PFAS in bald eagle plasma along the Central Wisconsin River. Now, obviously, eagles and birds don't really care about watershed boundaries. They can move quite long distances, but we saw strong enough evidence that the eagles in this area had some elevated PFAS in their blood that we decided to follow up and do some monitoring in the water body. And lastly, we had one site we were concerned about land spreading municipal biosolids. Like I said before, with municipal wastewater treatment plants, they don't produce the PFAS, but it certainly comes through their plant. And one thing they can do to recycle all the organic matter that they have is use it as this high quality fertilizer, this beneficial reuse. However, if there was PFAS in it, it now changes from a point source issue to a non-point source issue. So we tracked down some sites that received land spreading that may or may not have PFAS in it. And so here's where we did sampling. At all these sites, we did surface water chemistry and fish tissue sampling. Again, we did this as partly as a site investigation for water quality to figure out what's going on there. We also did this as part of the development of the water quality standard, which Megan will talk about a little bit later. We wanted to gather paired fish tissue and water chemistry samples. So just starting clockwise, we did some monitoring at the St. Louis River, the border of Minnesota, where actually Minnesota, their fisheries group was doing fish contaminants monitoring, and we just grabbed paired water chemistry samples there. Moving over the Menominee River at Marinette, this is really ground zero for PFAS contamination in Wisconsin, kind of the longest history and most well-known site. The Peshtigo River right next door. We did work on the Middle Wisconsin River. It's quite a long reach. We did a few sites on the Middle Wisconsin River. I should have said that. All of these sites, all of these rivers, we did a number of sites, 3 to 5 sites for each river, including a sampling site that was upstream of whatever known contamination that we knew about. So each of these call-out boxes here is a number of sites. We looked at Starkweather Creek and Lake Monona in Madison. We did a number of sites along the Mississippi River downstream of Minneapolis and the La Crosse River, and actually a couple tributaries to the La Crosse River near Fort McCoy. So just generally, I'll talk about some high-level monitoring results. We found in surface water, PFAS compounds were detected at all of the locations where we looked for them. This includes these control sites that are upstream of the contamination that we suspected. They're found at varying concentrations, and different compounds and different combinations of compounds were found at each of the sites. Anywhere from 3 to 17 out of the total of 36 that we could test for were found. Some of these sites, the concentrations were extremely low, like at the limit of our detection. Some were quite high. It was pretty variable in terms of each particular compound. What we did find, and you may have heard about in the news already, were the highest concentrations of PFAS, right? That specific PFAS compound that we know a lot about toxicity at Starkweather Creek in Dane County. The second highest values were Silver Creek, a tributary to the La Crosse River in Monroe County. And what's interesting about these sites is these are both two of the smaller streams that we investigated that are very close to known sources. The sources here are AFFF firefighting training grounds. It appears that, you know, these larger rivers produce enough dilution that we see much lower PFAS concentrations in the water body. A seemingly obvious result, but I think our monitoring backed that up. Where we do see really high concentrations are going to be these very small streams. So we'll just go over a little bit of data. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but just some results from across the state. Each of the sites I talked about before are color-coded with a different circle here, and those colors correspond to, on the right side of your screen, a couple of bar graphs. In this case, some of the values were 0 or so small that you probably actually can't see the bar matched up with the color, but just to give you some comparisons. The top right figure, we're looking at the maximum PFAS that we found in every sampling location. I already said Starkweather Creek was much higher than the rest of the state, but I think this bar graph kind of is a good example of that and shows you the magnitude of the difference. And again, Silver Creek over by Fort McCoy was the second highest. And just generally in these graphs, as we move left to right, we're seeing more total PFAS. If we were to sum up the individual analytes, but we're just focused on PFOS and PFOA here, the two we know the most about. On the bottom again, we see Starkweather Creek having the highest concentration of PFOA. We also did find this in the Wisconsin River, to a lesser extent the Mississippi River and Silver Creek. So quite a big variation in terms of the maximum amount of these analytes. However, certainly seems that Starkweather Creek was the highest. All right, there's a lot going on here, but we'll take it pretty easy. Again, what we're looking at are the rivers going left to right, generally low to high total PFAS as we move left to right. And this time we're looking at the percent of total PFAS. Just looking at, the idea here is just to look at the different analytes of PFAS and just how they compare across sites. So if you look at your y-axis, your vertical axis, you'll see that the highest number is 1, or you can think that as 100%, and all the bars reach up there. So if we have the sites on the left, and even the center and the left of the graph, you can think of these as small pies, but large colors in these individual pies, such as PFBA, which is this gray color, means that it's a really large slice of a small pie. And so PFBA is a PFAS analyte we know that was of concern from the 3M plant in Minnesota, or Minneapolis, more precisely, that was known from groundwater contamination in that area. So we suspected we'd find that in the Mississippi River, and sure enough we did. However, we found it at a number of other sites too. But again, remember, this is big slice, small pie, so not a really large concentration. As we move to the right, the sites that had more PFAS, we see PFOS start to show up on the screen. So again, these would be large slices of a large pie. So that'd be a lot of PFOS. We see other analytes like the yellow, kind of right in the middle of the bar, PFHXS. It's another one of these analytes that actually has been discontinued for production in the US since 2002, but we still see it showing up in the environment. Other things of note, coming all the way back to the left, the Menominee River at Marinette, 6,2 FTSA. That is a newer formulation of this firefighting foam. It's a replacement for PFOA and PFOS, but we're seeing that now start to show up in the environment. So there's considerable variability in terms of the makeup of each one of these sites, and the potential toxicity for each one of these may be vastly different. So comparing one analyte to another isn't totally appropriate, but looking at the relative contributions, I think, provides some interesting information. And if you're really interested in this stuff, we've put all of the data, all of the raw data for each of the 36 analytes, every single sample on the Wisconsin DNR website. If you go to our website, you type in PFAS in the search bar. Within 2 clicks, you can get to a screen that looks just like this. And if you're interested in all of these or just some of these water bodies, each of these drop-down bars will open up maps, show you raw data. But eventually, we're working on a report to put out there as well. So all the information will be easily accessible. There's no need to ask somebody to go through a database or have database access for you. We're just putting it all out there right up front. So we didn't talk about fish tissue results yet. That's because we only have fish tissue for one of the sites in. It's a much more intensive analysis at the lab to get fish tissue results than it is surface water. But what we do know is that we saw the highest concentrations, or we saw high concentrations of PFAS in fish tissue at Starkweather Creek and Lake Monona. Again, no surprise, the surface water was the highest here. We saw these comparable concentrations for top predators and panfish. Again, most other fish contaminants, we see higher concentrations in predators. So even being comparable, I think backs up that hypothesis that we see PFAS higher in panfish, at least relatively, than we do other contaminants. I have on here a comprehensive contaminant survey is planned for the spring of 2020 on Lake Monona that actually already happened. So we have all those fish, and those will be in line after the 2019 fish are done sampling. And then we're still waiting on the lab results for the remaining fish. Obviously, this safer at home stuff has thrown a wrench into everybody's plans, as well as our state lab, but they are still going through these samples just at a slower pace. And big results for Starkweather Creek and Lake Monona, or the results of the data, was an update to the fish consumption advice. If you are someone who is catching and eating fish, I hope that you know about the statewide fish consumption advice. You could get it by Googling Wisconsin fish consumption advice. We have a website called Eating Your Catch, Wisconsin Eating Your Catch. That search will get you there too. But there's these very easy to follow recommendations about how much fish you should eat per time period, week, month, year, of specific species that either applies statewide or are specific to certain water bodies. On Lake Monona, the meal restrictions or the recommendations for bluegill was moved 1 category. It used to be up to 1 meal a month. Now it's recommended only 1 meal per week for men or children beyond their childbearing years. You go to this website. Again, if you're eating your fish, you should know about this website. It's got very easy advice to follow, like this one, by species, pictures, and really straightforward rates to follow about how much you should be eating to protect yourself from any contaminants. And then lastly, I think this is my last slide, I want to wrap up with just some advice about ways to reduce your PFAS exposure in the environment. I am not a human health professional. However, we've worked with a number of them through this PFAS monitoring and communication plan. And I think there's some easy to follow steps that we could all practice in our everyday recreation lives to protect ourselves. So 1, you want to minimize ingestion of untreated surface water. Skin contact with PFAS in surface water bodies is not a concern. It's not going to soak through your skin. It's not going to give you a rash. Good news is you should not be ingesting a lot of untreated surface water anyways. That's just always good advice to follow. So if you're doing that, you're sort of protecting yourself from PFAS exposure. We've had a number of questions about PFAS foams or foams that may or may not contain PFAS. You don't want to really touch or play in these foams you may see on the windy side of a lake or on a river if you're below a whitewater rapid or some sort of dam. Just generally, foams contain viruses, bacteria, decaying organic matter. They may or may not contain PFAS. They may or may not contain other synthetic chemicals. So you really don't want to be playing with these or putting them on your face and making fun little foam beards. really you don't want to ingest whatever might be in that stuff. Again, good advice whether or not there's PFAS present. Washing your hands after playing in surface waters. You don't want whatever's in the water on your hands. You eat a delicious sandwich or some Cheetos and you lick the Cheeto dust off your fingers. Really good idea. Wash your hands after recreating in any water body, no matter what's in it. And then following fish consumption advisories, check out the website, look at the statewide advice, look at the water body specific advice. And the good news here is these are all just good practices to follow whenever you're recreating in surface waters. And if you follow those good hygienic practices, you will protect yourself from any PFAS exposure. So I think here I'm going to turn it back over to Megan.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So now that you have learned about all of the ways that we are assessing the concentrations of PFAS in Wisconsin's waters, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing from a regulatory standpoint and sort of what we're doing with some of that information. So this past January, I believe, we began a rulemaking effort to develop surface water quality standards for PFAS and PFOA. So when we talk about water quality standards, we often use this graphic, which many of you have probably seen before. It's the three-legged stool. So what that means is water quality standards are comprised of three things. One is the designated use for a water body. So it's the ideal condition for the water body, how we want the water body to be living its best life, so to speak. And then we have criteria, which are numeric or narrative conditions of the water body. So, you know, dissolved oxygen, pH, taste and odor, algae, bacteria, all these things that we measure to ensure that the water body is meeting its designated use. And then we have anti-degradation, which further protects against, say, once we have reached the ideal condition of the water body, we don't want to then backslide. So what we're talking about here mainly is criteria. I'm going to show this relationship on the next slide, which is a little busy, in a different way. So along the top here, we have our designated uses, which can be broadly defined or categorized into ecosystem health and human health. And then in the bottom panel, we have the criteria that goes into supporting each one of these designated uses. So the criteria that we're pursuing for PFAS and PFOA falls under the human health realm. And specifically, it is the public health and welfare designated use, and it falls under toxics criteria. So toxics criteria can be described in two different ways. If we have a substance where we can identify a level below which we don't expect people to have health effects from exposure to that, we call that a threshold criteria, because there's a threshold below which we don't expect to see health effects and above which we would expect to see health effects. If the exposure to a contaminant might cause cancer, we have a different type of criteria that's calculated in a different way, which is unsurprisingly called cancer criteria. So although I had previously mentioned that exposure to PFOA has been linked to cancer in humans, what we have found with the available science is that these threshold effects that we're looking at can actually occur at much lower concentrations than cancer. So what we have decided to pursue in order to protect against both cancer risk and other types of risks is threshold criteria. So this little figure here graphically shows how we calculate our human health threshold criteria. We have several variables that go into it, some of which I'll talk about in more detail. We have the acceptable daily exposure, which is a risk level, and I'll go more into that in a moment. We have a body weight constant of 70 kilograms. We have a relative source contribution, which is a measure of how much exposure we expect to see from interaction with surface waters or consuming fish taken from surface waters versus how much exposure we expect from other things like food or the air, personal care products, things like that. We have a standard fish consumption rate of 0.02 kilograms or 20 grams a day. We have a bioaccumulation factor, which I will also talk more about in a moment. And then we have drinking water intake rate of 2 liters per day. So several of these variables are specified for us in our Wisconsin Administrative Code. And so those variables are the same for all of the threshold criteria calculations that we do. But acceptable daily exposure and bioaccumulation factor are pollutant specific, which means that we have to calculate them for each compound that we're trying to get criteria for. So for PFAS and PFOA, the determination of the risk level, the acceptable daily exposure, was a joint effort between DHS and DNR. And then bioaccumulation factor is not used in any of the things that DHS does. And so that was really just derived by DNR, so by me. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about these two pollutant-specific measures to help you understand what goes into each one. So first, we have the acceptable daily exposure. And this is the maximum amount of something that you could be exposed to every day for your whole life and still not see any health effects. So in this little figure here, along the bottom, we have a representation of someone's life from when they're a baby all the way until they are pretty old. And then along the left-hand side, we have the amount of pollutant with less at the bottom and more at the top. And like I was saying, for threshold criteria, we expect there to be some amount of exposure where above that, we would see adverse health effects, and below that, we would not see health effects. And what the criteria and this acceptable daily exposure are designed to do is set a level where you can have cumulative exposure to something for your whole lifetime and you still don't exceed that value that would cause adverse health effects. So myself and Sarah Yang at DHS, as well as other toxicologists at DHS and epidemiologists, reviewed a lot of data that's available, as well as some risk assessments that were conducted by the EPA and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is known as ATSDR, as well as, things from Health Canada. And we came up with an acceptable daily exposure value of 2 nanograms per kilogram per day for PFAS, and then the same value also for PFOA. On March 23rd, we had a stakeholder group meeting for this rulemaking effort, during which we went into really detailed discussions about how we came up with this acceptable daily exposure value. So if you go to the DNR website and in the search bar type NR105, one of the search results will be our rule change effort. And on that page, there's a stakeholder group meeting tab, which contains both a video of that meeting where we go into this really in detail acceptable daily exposure determination, as well as our presentation slides from that day. So if you want more information on how this ADE was derived, feel free to head over there and then you can get lots more information. So now I'm going to talk about bioaccumulation and the bioaccumulation factor. Again, this is something that's just done at DNR. DHS is doesn't use this, so they don't have any reason to derive it. So bioaccumulation is, we're talking about an increase in the concentration of something in an animal over time. So a fish is swimming around in a water body, and as it ages and gets older, it will accumulate more and more of a contaminant. This is different from biomagnification, where we see lower trophic levels having less of the contaminant and higher trophic levels having more of the contaminant. What we're talking about with bioaccumulation is just any individual fish swimming around accumulating more of a contaminant through time. And bioaccumulation incorporates uptake of the contaminant both from the diet, so what the fish is consuming, as well as partitioning from the water as it passes over the gills. It also takes into account elimination of the contaminant. So bioaccumulation, the bioaccumulation factor is just a ratio of how much is in the fish tissue to how much is in the water. And again, at our March 23rd stakeholder group meeting, I went into really a lot of detail about bioaccumulation and the data that went into it. So if you head over to our NR 105 rule page, you can also learn a lot more about bioaccumulation factors and all the data that we have thus far that went into this calculation. So what I was able to do by looking at data that Wisconsin has collected thus far, as well as data that has been collected in Minnesota and Michigan and the province of Ontario, is derive these bioaccumulation factors. And I have a range of them that I'm about to show on the next slide, because there are a couple different ways that, different data that you can include or exclude. And I'm showing a range here because we also, as Mike was mentioning, don't have fish tissue data for all of our 2019 monitoring efforts yet. So we're expecting that our bioaccumulation factors for PFAS and PFOA will be in these ranges that are displayed on the screen, but we don't have, they're not final yet. So what we can gather from this figure, we see the PFAS bioaccumulation factors would range from anywhere from about 2,900 to 3,400, whereas the PFOA bioaccumulation factors would only range from about 30 to 60. And what this tells us is that PFAS is much more bioaccumulative than PFOA. So if you see a small amount of PFOA in a water body, you could reasonably expect that there will also be a small amount in the fish tissue. Whereas if you see a small amount of PFAS in a water body, you might see much, much higher concentrations in the fish tissue, and therefore greater risk to human health is posed by PFAS when we're talking about fish consumption compared with PFOA. And you'll notice if you go to our fish consumption advisory web pages that our PFAS-based, that our fish consumption advisories are based on PFAS and not PFOA, for this reason, that PFAS is more bioaccumulative, so you'd expect to see more of it even if there's a small amount in the water. So just to bring it all back together, we have our human health threshold criteria. Many of these parameters are specified in code. Acceptable daily exposure is a joint effort between DHS and DNR. Bioaccumulation factor is DNR only. And now that we have the likely range of bioaccumulation factors and we also have our acceptable daily exposure value, we can come up with a likely range of surface water criteria to protect human health. Once again, I say it's a likely range because we don't have all of our 2019 DNR data back yet. So the numbers may change slightly, but we feel reasonably confident that this is, a likely range. So for PFAS, we expect the surface water quality criteria to be around 2 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion. And for PFOA, because it is less bioaccumulative, we expect to see higher surface water criteria in the 35 to 45 part per trillion range. Once again, these are likely ranges because we don't have all of our 2019 data yet, but this is what we're expecting. And this is for the protection of human health from interactions with surface water from recreation or incidental ingestion, as well as consumption of fish taken from our surface waters. So now I just want to talk briefly about what our criteria will end up being used for. So, great, we say, okay, you can only have 2 parts per trillion of PFAS in the water. Like, how does that actually affect anything? So one of the main ways that these criteria are used are in wastewater permits. So we have a facility that may be discharging PFAS or other types of contaminants into a water body, and we want to be protective of the surface water criteria, which applies in the water body itself. And so what we do, or I should say what our wastewater folks do, I don't do it and Mike doesn't do it, but what DNR does is look at how much a facility is discharging, and then they take into account characteristics of the water body itself, so how fast it flows and how deep it is, how wide it is, that type of thing. And then they say, okay, facility, you can discharge this amount of a contaminant and still protect the surface water criteria. So we still don't go above, this level that is deemed to be protective of human health. So before we get to actually implementing these criteria in our wastewater permits, we have to go through a rulemaking effort. And I'm going to show the timeline for that on the next slide. So we have an estimated timeline that stretched from 2019 all the way to 2022. Right now we are in 2020. So we are drafting our rule, and like I mentioned, we're having meetings of our advisory groups. And then this winter, we're going to prepare our rule and then solicit information for our economic impact analysis. And then, the rulemaking process will stretch into 2021, and then hopefully the rule will become effective by summer of 2022. Of course, as the past month or so has demonstrated, wrenches can be thrown into plans all the time. So this is an estimated timeline at this point, and we're really hoping that we can stick to it, but it's definitely not set in stone. But if you're interested in participating in our advisory groups, feel free to sign up for one of our Gov delivery lists, because that's how we often get the information out to people about our upcoming rules. So now I think we have about
You got about 5 minutes left.
Yep, we have about 5 minutes left for questions. I'm gonna put our contact info here, and then we have one more slide that deals with the Lakes Convention that we'll put up in a minute or two after you guys have a chance to look at our contact info. So thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Sorry I cut you off there.
No problem.
Right at the end. We did have a few questions that came through while you and Mike were giving the presentation. Some of them may have been kind of answered, but I'll just go through and make sure that they get covered. One of them was asking if PFAS compounds bioaccumulate up the food chain like PCBs in fish. I don't know if you want to discuss anything more on that.
Sure. So what I think we have found thus far is that PFAS do not bioaccumulate up. They don't biomagnify up a food chain. PCBs actually don't biomagnify either. They're lipophilic, so they are more likely to be found in fatty fish. But you know, a fatty fish like a carp or something doesn't necessarily have to be at the top of the food chain. Mercury definitely does biomagnify up the food chain, so we see small amounts in panfish, we see much more in mercury, in walleye and muskies, and then more in like eagles and other top predators. I don't know if you have anything to add, Mike. But.
And there was another question about fish consumption advisories, but I know you covered that. People know that they can go to the DNR's website and look into that. Another question here, do water treatment plant sludge and paper company sludge contain PFAS? At what level do PFAS lead to negative human reactions?
So, Mike, you can feel free to jump in if you want. We, like Mike said, wastewater treatment plants are not producing PFAS, but they do act as sort of a collection point. So we would expect those sludges to contain PFAS from sort of upstream users. I don't know for sure about paper companies. Do you have any opinions on that, Mike?
I think some specialty papers with waterproofing may use PFAS in the production. I know that I'm not advocating for a company, but Right in the Rain paper does not use PFAS for their waterproofing, but I'm not sure about all specialty papers. So that would be the case in which they use PFAS in the production.
Thank you. Next question. Are PFAS compounds used in oil and gas exploration and drilling operations, either during production or for fighting fires?
I would, so I don't know for sure about oil and gas exploration and drilling. I think in a lot of manufacturing and industrial processes where sort of water and stain repelling is useful, there's likely that some type of PFAS is used. However, I don't know for sure which types of PFAS are used in which types of industries, because as Mike had mentioned, PFAS and PFOA and other longer chain types of PFAS were voluntarily put out of production in the early 2000s. Same with fighting fires. I know there's been some a push to get rid of this AFFF, or PFAS in AFFF, but it's hard to know what specific PFAS are used in every type of scenario. I'm sorry.
That's a good question. We do know that if you remember the Husky oil refinery fire in Superior, Wisconsin, they did use PFAS foam to put that out. If you were to ask me what's worse, having an oil refinery on fire or using PFAS to put out the fire, you know, it's one of those things I'd say, you know, put out the fire. It's a really dangerous situation. So that's why they still need the good stuff to put out these really serious, life-threatening fires.
There had been another question earlier on asking about PFAS and foams along shorelines, but I think you did a pretty good job of covering that. And then Gina La Liberté also posted some information where people can go to find out more information about that. And then finally, there was Question here, the Madison water utility voluntarily tests for PFAS to determine their presence. Are water utilities going to be required to test for, and if present at the threshold criteria, filter PFAS to protect public health?
Well, so I think, so I should clarify that Madison Water Utility, that is a drinking water plant. The surface water criteria that we're talking about here is for the protection of surface waters. Although we do have concurrent rulemaking efforts for drinking water and groundwater standards. And so it's likely that if we do promulgate drinking water standards, then the utilities will have to test for them and remove them.
Well, thank you so much for clarifying some of those questions. We are at our time. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in our first ever online Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Convention. As a reminder, please fill out the exit survey. This can be found on the bottom of the Friday virtual agenda, or Paul Skowinski did post the link on the chat box. We hope to see you next year in person. The dates are set for March 24th through the 26th of 2021. It'll be held at the Stevens Point Holiday Inn and Convention Center. Please watch for an email with a link to participate in the survey. And we'd love your feedback regarding how the virtual convention experience was this year. Again, thank you for joining us. And if there's no other questions, we hope you stay safe. Please fill out the survey. We're really hoping to see how this worked for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks everyone, and good job by the organizers changing the format so quickly.